So thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you all for the invitation to talk to you. It's a pleasure to sort of be virtually there. I should also thank very much, if I can get the right screen, the key team, the key members of ASIC Inscriptions Online. So Stephen above all, Peter Liddell, Crystal Eel, Finley McCourt and Irene, who is also here, and really absolutely central to the proper operation of the site. So they've all contributed knowingly or unknowingly to what I'm going to say today. I will take all of the blame for what I say, but all of the credit should go to those people. As my rather dull title indicates, what I'll do is just sum up a little bit about the past of ASIC Inscriptions Online, sort of what the site was trying to do in its early days. I'll say rather more about where we're at now in terms of what we cover and what we're currently trying to do, and then a little bit at the end about what I see as the goals and the challenges for ASIC Inscriptions Online in the future. So back to the days of 2012. Now this, I don't know if Stephen, if this was you at the IIS. I stole this from the IIS website. So Stephen in 2012 created ASIC Inscriptions Online, and this is his statement of what he was trying to do at the time. And I think for all of us as epigraphers or people who use inscriptions, the problem that Stephen identified is a clear and pressing one, that our material is very hard for non-specialists to access. There's a whole sort of barricade of things which stop undergraduate students in particular, but also non-specialist sort of other classicists and ancient historians from using our stuff. A linguistic barrier is the big one, especially for undergraduates in the UK, and I suspect also in the US to a great extent, of not knowing Greek, but also the linguistic barrier of not knowing Latin or other modern European languages. This is needed to engage with the printed corpora of most of our texts. I think you can't put IG on an undergraduate reading list and expect any more than a very tiny fractional percentage of students actually to read something like that. And then a sort of a different but slightly related problem, that inscriptions of course keep changing, and that hard copy resources can't keep up with those changes. So even if you set a student an IG inscription to read, and by some miracle they located it and were able to read it, that might very well not be the most up-to-date version of the text. So that broadly is the problem that AIO was set up to try to solve. These are sort of the founding principles as I've extracted them from what Stephen told me about his rationale at the start of the project. So translated, annotated inscriptions with enough sort of transliteration in them to keep them sort of historically honest, so that there is the option, which is switchable on or off, to use transliterations for certain key terms. Another key principle is that we should always try and have the most up-to-date version of the text, so that our translations reflect the best, which is almost always the most recent edition. But that we acknowledge that often people will come to look for an inscription via an outdated reference. So unlike PHI, which has a slightly different approach to how it deals with multiple texts, we just have one sort of single point of truth translation. But if you are working with an out-of-date reference, you'll end up with the most recent text. Another key principle is that we didn't want to, or Stephen didn't want to, duplicate existing resources, but complement them. So rather than representing material which is already available in other online places, we would link to that material. And last and not least, the site was always intended to develop dynamically, so to keep growing, particularly in terms of content. And I'll say more in the middle part of the talk about how that works in practice. So this is what it looked like, not at the very, very beginning. This is from the Wayback Web, which didn't scrape the site at the end of 2012, but caught up with it fairly early on in 2013. And the thing that struck me when I looked at this is how similar it is to what's there now. If you've used Attic Inscriptions online recently, it's not radically different. In fact, there's still some text on the front page, which I think is identical to the text which was there in early 2013. I think that's probably a good thing, but maybe we can talk about that in discussion. But what you will notice is that it's a bit more simple. It's rather more sort of bare bones in terms of what's there and the possibilities for accessing material. This is what an inscription entry looked like in the very early days of the site. Again, not radically dissimilar from what's available now, but sort of less there. This might be a feature of how the Wayback Machine has captured the site. There don't seem to be any notes on this entry at this stage, but maybe they just fallen off the edge. But notice that transliterations were possible right from the start. The other thing that's there right from the start, this principle that I already mentioned, of being able to access the text sort of almost no matter what reference you've got. So the text which is translated here was Stephen's bang up to date new IG2 cubed edition of the decree on the sacred orgas, but many people would come to that from Rhodes Osborne, from IG2 squared, and it's possible to reach the text via that route. So initially the site had 230-ish, I'm gonna have to look at my notes to confirm the exact number, 281 inscriptions when it first launched, based particularly on Stephen's work on the fascicle of IG2 cube dealing with the Athenian decrees of the 3rd quarter of the 4th century BC. So that was the heart of the site at the beginning. Since then, as I'm sure you know, it's continued to grow in various ways. This is what the site looks like now, or looked like a couple of days ago when I took this screenshot. As you can see, I think just from this, it's quite similar in terms of look and feel, but richer and sort of denser. There's more going on the site, and I'll work through some of those changes in more detail in a bit. And that's what that Rhodes Osborne 58 IG2 cubed 1292 entry looks like now. So there are clear similarities, but also more stuff has been added on. I'd be really interested to know, actually, if people have thoughts in discussion, how people feel about the sort of overall appearance of the site. It doesn't strike me as dated, but I'm aware that if you use a site every day, then you don't notice, maybe you don't have the same view of it. So how people feel about the general interface would be interesting to know. So a little bit more about sort of what's changed in those almost 10 years since Stephen created the site. So we've stuck to the founding principles, more or less. We've tried to stick to them, I think. We've added more ways to get at the text. So initially you could browse or you could search. We've added more ways of browsing by find spot, by category of inscriptions. There's a slight sort of can of worms of how you categorize inscriptions. A very dedicated volunteer has recently done some work in trying to slightly regularize our categories by location of various sorts and so on. So there's more ways to get at the text, and something that we can see from the site, the analytics on the site, is that browsing by publication remains a popular way of getting at things. So we have a sense people are coming to the site with an IG reference and getting at inscriptions that way. That's maybe the most popular way of finding stuff. One quite significant change that's happened in the last few years is that we've started to do more with Greek text. So obviously the goal of the site is about translations and precisely not providing the Greek text, but we've started to add links to Greek text, and on some occasions include our own Greek texts. So here's an example of linking. So going back to Rhodes Osborne 58, where we now have links, weren't there at the very start, to PHI and to IG Online when they have a text available. For some of the inscriptions, particularly those connected with the Attic Inscriptions in the UK project, which I'll say more about in a minute, as part of our work on the inscriptions, we've created or edited or re-edited text. So the most up-to-date text is in fact our own text. And on those instances, we now include the Greek text on Attic Inscriptions online. I'll say a little bit, but Irene will be able to say much more, I think, in discussion about XML Epidoc, which we use to a certain extent and in a not entirely compliant with the standards way. So there is XML Epidoc underlying, or at least some XML Epidoc underlying the encoding of these texts. But as you can see, it's not, you wouldn't know that it was there unless you've been told that it was there. It's not visible, unlike other so inscriptions of Aphrodisias, for example, where it's very clear and the user can change the view of the Greek text and do things with the XML. So it's sort of discrete XML Epidoc is my non-technical way of describing it. But again, that's something that we might want to talk about in discussion. We're continuing, again, this sort of building on an original principle of linking to other sources of information. So we've relatively recently, I think, added in place information, which comes from the Pleiades website. So again, something you can toggle on or off if you want to find out where places are, and then that will take you through to the Pleiades entries for those places. Images is something that's been added in occasionally where we have permissions, and particularly these are cases where we've been working on the inscriptions ourselves. We would have our own images on the site, but more usually we're linking to other available images, including the Squeeze collection at the IIS through the Cratheros project. So we're trying to, again, to make use of other resources which are out there. Penultimately, a thing which we've added to the site are more supporting materials in the form of, I suppose, almost conventional scholarly papers, AIO papers and AIO Key papers. So the latter, again, associated with the Attic inscriptions in the UK papers. And what the site's doing there is really just acting as a repository for these publications. So they're conventional PDFs that people download, as one might from JSTOR, with the key difference that ours are freely available, and contain more specialist discussions of aspects sort of raised by the inscriptions that we're publishing on the site, or other things that people who are contributing to the site have been working on. And there's some really important discussions. I think I'd single out Crystal Eel's study of the Roman Ephebeia, which is a really significant piece of scholarship, but it's on our site as an AIO paper. Last and not least, the most recent addition to the site is an area called Attic Inscriptions Education, AIE, which in some ways is a bit like the AIO papers in that it's really a repository of resources. So not necessarily something that happens on the site itself, but a place where people can download useful materials. What that is aimed at doing is it's targeted especially at the English, Welsh and Scottish school curricula, and has resources aimed at teachers from sort of beginning sort of primary level education up to A level and higher. So that's the final school examination in the UK, all of which in some ways engage with the Greek world and to some extent with inscriptions, and sort of providing resources to encourage teachers who typically will have absolutely no expertise in this at all, to encourage them to feel more confident in using inscriptions, pointing them towards resources on the website. So that's, again, a place where the resources are there to take away. So it's PDFs and PowerPoints primarily, rather than actual web stuff. But it's an important part, I think, of what we're trying to do in terms of increasing the accessibility of inscriptions. That's the sort of thing that it looks like. Key Stage 1 is the beginning. The UK government is obsessed with labelling every stage of a child's development and what they should know at each stage. So Key Stage 1, they're meant to be able to do certain things with Greek myth, and now with Greek inscriptions. Actually, I didn't. That wasn't the last thing. The last and most important thing that we've been doing in these 10 years is adding yet more inscriptions to the site. So we started off with 280 odd, or Stephen started off with 280 odd. We've now got about 2,000 roughly. That might have changed since we last had a count. How have those new inscriptions landed on the site? That's something it's maybe worth spending a bit more time to explain. Some of them, about 200, slightly fewer at this point, have come from this specific project, Attic Inscriptions in the UK, which is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council as a sort of ring-fenced effort to track down, re-edit, republish all of the Athenian, non-Indigenous, they're not necessarily non-Indigenous, all of the Athenian inscriptions, which for one reason or another have landed in British and Northern Irish collections. And that work has been done by people who are sort of specifically meant to be working on that project, so have been bought out of their main jobs to do that work. So that accounts for a couple of hundred of the additions. But the vast majority of the new material on the site has really come through volunteer work of one sort or another. So work done by people who are actually doing something else. It's part of their official projects, or what they've told their universities that they're doing, but as part of their sort of euergetic activity have contributed the fruits of their researches to Attic Inscriptions Online. So Stephen has done a huge amount of work on this. Of course, Chris DeLille, as part of his work on Roman Athens, has added a lot of material, but also graduate students who want to get experience in working on inscriptions, and really a large number of just helpful, kind, interested volunteers have contributed stuff. Now that I think is great and a big part of what makes AIO work, but obviously it brings challenges, and I'll say a little bit more about those at the very end, because someone's got to check. Someone's got to keep an eye on the quality of all of this stuff. At the moment, that someone is primarily Stephen, who does a lot of work in checking and correcting and improving translations as they come in, and making sure that we keep a level of consistency across the site. Irene also is absolutely critical in keeping things working and keeping things at a sort of consistent and coherent standard. Aaron asked me to say a little bit about how we sort of fit into the epigraphic landscape. So I've already mentioned a couple of things. I mean, I think the main thing we try and do is link what we're doing and link our resource to other resources. So we link to PHI and IG Online. We link to image database and to Pleiades. Something that sort of then enables us to do is to, once we link to IG Online, for example, or to the CGRN database, then that also then links to non-English translations of inscriptions, which maybe some users find useful. And we also can link through to their expertise and their resource. So CGRN is quite a good example, I think. So here's a sacrificial regulation, not the longest inscription on our site, but this is something which CGRN have covered and commented on in more detail than we could have commented in detail, but it doesn't seem worth replicating their expertise. So as you'll see in the note, what we do is give a very brief explanation, but then say, just go and look at CGRN and you'll get the full story about this text. Now I'm on very shaky ground here, but we have an API, which I think enables other people to use our resource. Again, it's a little bit tucked away on the site, but it is there. I'd be, again, interested to know how much people are making use of that, and if there are things that we could do. But for example, to get at the XML epidoc, that's, as I understand it, the route that one would take to extract that sort of information, or to link to that sort of information on our site. So I note that it's there, and I will say no more for fear of saying something false. And the last thing is a bit of a mystery to me. Again, I'm very grateful for intelligence on this. We were involved with Eagle from at the very early stage of the Eagle project, and are still listed on the Eagle site as one of their contributing sites. But as far as I can see, Eagle doesn't have all of our information on it. If I look for stuff on Eagle, which I know is on AIO, it doesn't bring up any results. So I'm, to be honest, not quite sure what's happening with Eagle. But so if there's someone here who is up to date on Eagle developments, I would be very happy to have some input and guidance on how we can get our data up to date on Eagle. A quick word about who's using all of this stuff. So our headline figure looks super impressive, but obviously that includes all the many bots that crawl the web. The more meaningful number, I think, is probably the 3,500 or so users, which maybe doesn't sound amazing, but for a bit of context, there are about, again, this is the number I have to write down, there are about 7,000 undergraduate students in classical disciplines in all of the United Kingdom at the moment. Obviously, United Kingdom users aren't all of our users, but so actually 3,500 in the context of the total number of people who might ever want to look at an inscription, I think is pretty good. And the more qualitative data that Stephen pulled together a couple of years ago, I think backs up that picture that that university users, particularly university teachers, are a big part of our user group, and that people are sort of on the site for about 6 minutes, which again fits with the sort of way that we, I think, would hope the site would be used, that people are coming on to read an inscription and the notes and then going off and doing something useful with it. Here is our most popular inscription. This might surprise you. It slightly surprised me. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the League of Carinae, the League of Carinae, which is what this inscription is. It's the Athenian treaty with Philip II. But it wouldn't, if you'd asked me what's the most visited inscription on the site, I wouldn't have gone for this one, I think. Why is this our most visited inscription? Well, it had 492 views, so it's not, it's not that everyone in the world, all 3,500 visitors, are looking at it. But if you dig down a bit into the data, and I'm very grateful to Krista Leal who did this work, almost all of those views came in 1 week from one city. And so the conclusion that Chris drew, and I'm sure he's right, is that this was a university assignment. Someone in Newcastle University set this inscription for their students who all dutifully went to visit it, which actually I think is great, because this is exactly what we were hoping, or Stephen was hoping, I think, that the site would be used for, that it would make it possible for university teachers to set inscriptions and actually for students to use those inscriptions. So it's maybe a bit of a shame that not every university is doing this. I think we'd hope to see more of these spikes, but it does show that that's one of the ways in which the site is meeting its objectives. This is too much data to take in, I suspect, on one slide, but just a sense of what the other popular inscriptions are. This is everything that's had more than 100 views. There's a clustering still, I think, around sort of more conventional inscriptions in a way, so stuff to do with the Athenian Empire, the stele with the Attic stele with confiscations after the Herms and Mysteries. Another sort of slightly unexpected one, funerary inscription for a midwife. Again, that's a case where it got lots of views in 1 week from one place, so very probably was set as an assignment in a university. And lastly, a quick word about where our users come from, which I think maybe not an unexpected pattern. Majority, well, not a majority, but the biggest minority is from the UK and then the USA, but actually quite a lot of users from non-Anglophone countries as well. Last of all, a bit about where we're going to go next, or where we hope to go next. One of our, well, probably our most important goal, I guess, is to keep adding inscriptions. So we're up to about 2,000. There are about 20,000 Attic inscriptions, so we've got a way to go. If we were aiming to have everything on the site, I'm not sure we are aiming to include every single Attic inscription, because I'm not sure how much benefit there is to having, say, every single gravestone on AIO. So we're obviously, at least, and also 20,000 is not a short-term goal anyway, so we're going to be selective in what we do. Some of our sort of priorities would be to keep up with the new IG volumes. So as IG2 Cubes continues its work to try and make sure that we, as far as we can, include that new material on our site. Laws and decrees is another priority area, because actually, as we've just seen briefly in the user stats, that's still a thing that people are interested in on the site, and also probably the sort of translations and commentaries. I've just had a warning that my connection is unstable, so I hope that I'm still audible. This will be the students next door on their PlayStations. And also sort of beyond that, thinking about inscriptions which usefully illustrate key themes in teaching and research. So one area, for example, is inscriptions of Rome and Athens, which are often actually hard to get at in translation, but it's an area which is sort of rightly becoming more popular, both in research and in teaching. And then the other sort of category of developments is technical development. So some stuff on our to-do list. Think in continuing to improve what we're doing with images. As I say, we don't have a huge number of images hosted on the site, but we do have some. And at the moment, it's a little bit clunky in terms of how those are integrated into the site. Epidoc, I think, is a big thing that we need to sort of bite the bullet on and think about, partly making sure that our use of Epidoc is a bit less maverick than it is in some respects, and making ourselves more consistent, but maybe adding more, doing more by way of marking up text. At the moment, for example, we don't routinely mark up personal names or names of deities, and that slightly limits what might be possible by way of indexing and searching and stuff like that. So that's something that I think we are going to try and think about. And then beyond that, maybe more continuing to think about ways that we can integrate our data with other sites. So one possibility, especially if we have more Greek text on the site, is to integrate with Alpheos, for example, in terms of sort of word study and word analysis. So those are the sorts of technical things on our radar, but no doubt that list will continue to develop and grow as technology develops and grows. Last of all, what's stopping us from doing all of that? I suspect that none of these things will be a surprise to anybody on this call. Money, it is in the UK, and well, be interesting to hear if it's the same everywhere else. It's very hard to get funding for this sort of thing. Funding bodies like to fund discrete projects with clear outcomes that can claim to be, changing the world in sort of dramatic ways. And although I think Attic Inscriptions Online is changing the world in useful ways, it's not doing it in quite the ways that tick funders' boxes. So the situation is that sometimes, as with Attic Inscriptions in the UK, there is a sort of carvable off element, and the sort of thing that bodies are happy to fund, and then we can sort of almost secretly use that as a way of improving Attic Inscriptions Online. So, for example, the increased use of Greek text is really a spin-off of Attic Inscriptions in the UK. But more commonly, what we're doing is sort of looking for little pots of money, of sort of £1,000 here and there that universities occasionally offer. So it's a sort of constant worry as sort of where the money is going to come from, and I don't see an obvious solution to that, to be honest, short of some sort of philanthropist deciding to give us an enormous amount so we can set up an AIO endowment. That seems relatively unlikely. The second challenge is people. I've already alluded to this, that the site relies on a lot of goodwill and volunteer work from a team of people, certainly in terms of growth. But it also relies on having a sort of steering hand on the tiller, which at the moment is Stephen. But we have to think about continuity and sort of long-term planning, and Stephen's been doing really wonderful work on that in terms of thinking about the editorial team and trying to ensure that there will be continuity. But again, it's not an easy thing to do, and it's something that takes work to try and ensure longevity. And I think that's probably a challenge that a great many epigraphic and other projects have. How do you keep it going beyond the first? Even keeping it going this well for 10 years, I think, is quite an achievement, looking at some other projects. Then the third challenge is technology. again, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, that even small changes in technology can have knock-on effects. So we changed server last year, I think, which sort of broke the site in quite spectacular ways and unexpected ways. And even sort of things like the search function are still only just recovering from what should have been a fairly straightforward change. So I think, again, we have to keep working on the site and making sure that it keeps functioning, because otherwise it will break, and we have to be aware of that. One technical change recently, which we hope is going to help with that, is that the British School at Athens is now the official host of Attic Inscriptions Online, and we're hoping that will give some of the sort of institutional stability that will help us. Won't help with the money necessarily, in fact definitely won't help with the money, because the BSA is as skint as the rest of us, but in terms of people to some extent, but I think especially technology, we're hoping that will give a slightly greater long-term stability to the site. But yeah, these are all things that maybe don't quite keep us awake at night, but maybe cause us pause from time to time. However, I wanted to end on a more positive note, partly to reiterate my thanks to the first 5 people on this list, but also to reiterate another point that I've made about the size of the Attic Inscriptions Online community, in terms of these sort of people actively contributing to keeping this site growing and keeping it, you know, a really, I think, important resource for epigraphers and students of Athenian history. It's a massive list. This might not even be the complete list. It's a list that keeps on growing. And also it's an international list, and that's also something that I find very, very pleasing and very reassuring. So I think that gives us something to be optimistic about as Attic Inscriptions heads into its second decade of existence, and I hope beyond. So thank you very much for your attention.